Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, Greg Anthony here, and glad you're back on the Investigative Journal on this Monday, March 13th, 2017 day on our calendar. Before I get to my Jesuit quote of the day, I want to talk about two subjects today. One, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, certain aspects of it. And two, if you ever wonder why God creates evil, why he allows evil to exist? And we're going to look at that subject. But now, so don't go away. Make sure you come back because they're going to both be interesting. All right, the organization of the hierarchy is a complete military despotism. I wonder who that is. Well, Brigadier General Thomas Harris made this statement. He wrote a book. It was about 30 years after the assassination of Lincoln. And he said this, quote, "The organization of the Roman Catholic hierarchy is a complete military despotism, of which the Pope is the ostensible, apparent, seemingly head, but of which the Black Pope, the superior general of the Jesuits, is the real head. The Black Pope is the head of the order of the Jesuits and is called a general, the superior general. He not only has command of his own order, but directs and controls the general policy of the Roman Catholic Church. He, the Black Pope, is the power behind the throne and is the real potential head of the hierarchy. The whole machine is under strictest rules of military discipline. The whole thought and will of this machine to plan, propose, and execute is found in its head. There is no independence of thought or of action in its subordinate parts. Implicit and unquestioning obedience to the orders of the superiors in authority is the sworn duty of the priesthood of the grade." Now, today we have the Black Pope and the White Pope are the same. They've taken over. Pope Francis is both a Jesuit, so he has to be, what is he, a Black and White Pope, we should call him? But anyway, like I said, they've really taken over the Vatican now, and when you understand how deceptive they've been through the course of history, you'll know that we're looking at an unprecedented situation there in Rome. And in fact, recently the Pope came out and said he may favor allowing married priests to marry or married men to become priests because there's a shortage of priests. Okay, well, what does that lead to? So if he says, I wouldn't mind having married priests come into the order, that would open up the door for priests to get married. And knowing how many homosexuals there are in this organization, would there be priests marrying priests and nuns marrying nuns, and how far does it go? But anyway, let me get to what I want to talk about first, and that's the Lincoln assassination. Okay, I brought up Brigadier General Thomas Harris in my opening Jesuit quote, and that's for good reason. We have to go back to Lincoln to really understand how they frame people today. When we look at how the Jesuits were involved in the Lincoln assassination, we will see how they basically were involved in the Kennedy assassination, how they frame people to this day, i.e. the Alamo Ministry and Tony Alamo, and how all these organizations today work similarly to the way they did back during the time of Lincoln. Now, Charles Chiniquy, if you don't know, you don't get the, if you're not familiar with the facts of the Lincoln assassination, you have to go way back to before he was a president, when he represented a Catholic priest who was on the outs from the Vatican. He was basically in the Chicagoland area, in the Illinois area, and he was basically trying to tell people that the church was up to no good and wanted to overthrow the country. And so basically they were going to get rid of him. And what they did is the Jesuits, as was proven in the trial when Lincoln defended him, the Jesuits framed Chiniquy for rape. And we went through that whole trial. That should be on the record. But you don't hear much about that, do you? They don't tell you much about that. They don't tell you about all the little things Lincoln found out about the conspiracy to overthrow America even back then. And after Chiniquy was exonerated by Lincoln's, as Lincoln was his defense attorney, a lot of information came out in that trial, and Chiniquy told Lincoln that the Jesuits will never forget you. And Chiniquy quoted him later after Lincoln was killed. Chiniquy did say this. He said, "The great fatal mistake of the American government in the prosecution of the assassinations of Abraham Lincoln was never to get to the bottom of how the Jesuits did it." And you might look, when on April 9th, 1865, Richmond at that time fell and the Confederacy surrendered to Grant. Less than a week later, on the evening of April 14th, at Ford's Theater, during an instant of hilarious laughing, one of the country's leading actors, John Wilkes Booth, cried out the oath summarizing the liberation theology of Cardinal Bellarmine back then, "Sic semper tyrannis," and that's death to tyranny. He fired a shot into the head of Lincoln, and basically Booth's cry has been intended to give the assassination the look of an official act by a lone gunman, similar to Lee Harvey Oswald, correct? And basically, he was touted for sympathy for Cuba, initially gave the Kennedy assassination the look of a communist revenge. And basically, the same thing happened back during the time of Lincoln. It was given the cloak of the assassination of a supposed lone gunman was... and that's what we learn today in history. Now, I can remember going throughout all of my history classes through grade school, high school, college, and they never got into the story. It was always just Booth did it by himself. But really, that's not the way it went down. And the way you look at it is that this was sympathy. They tell you it must have been the Confederates' responsibility for the beloved president's assassination because of the way he treated the South. So that was the ruse they used. But you never are told that Booth had associated with 7 people who were brought to the trial less than a month following the assassination. Somehow the history books forget that. It was not a civilian trial, but a special 11-man military tribunal appointed by Johnson called the Hunter Commission. Now, why wouldn't they have a regular criminal trial? Now, what that reminds me of, why doesn't Trump today ever, or the people in government, ever prosecute Clinton for all of the deeds that they have done? And we've gone over that in depth. They just let her get away with it, so don't they work together? Counsel for the defendants objected to the commission, arguing that the military had no jurisdiction over civilians. The objection was overruled and the trial moved forward. Within 7 weeks, the commission, a 2/3 majority, not what was required of a civil jury, found 4 of the co-conspirators guilty, and on July 7th, 1865, they were hanged. Now that's left out, isn't it? Now they don't also tell you this story, that there was one Mr. I believe it was Charles Surratt. He was Mary Surratt's son, I believe, and they had been meeting they were planning out the assassination of Lincoln, and Surratt was the only one of the group that escaped. Now he was given sanctuary. Reminds me of sanctuary cities today, right? Here we got the federal government at that time looking for Surratt, who hightailed it to Canada, given sanctuary in a Catholic church. The authorities are trying to find Surratt because they want to get all of these conspiracy theories, all these people who are involved in it. Correct? Well, he's given sanctuary. Then he's sent to the Vatican where he's given sanctuary. He's hidden out under a false name as one of the Swiss Guard. And when the authorities and the patriots back then finally realized he was in the Vatican let him loose, and he was caught in Egypt. Surratt was brought back, and boy, this trial reminded me of the Tony Alamo trial that went on just recently, where a Christian pastor has been framed for crimes he didn't commit because he criticized the Jesuits. He wasn't afraid to talk about exactly what I'm talking about here, sending millions of brochures worldwide for over 40 years. And they created a travesty of justice in Arkansas like you've never seen before. But in America today, nobody connects the dots. But back then, there was a travesty of justice in the Surratt trial, and it was a hung jury, and Surratt, who was involved in the killing of Lincoln, was never convicted. He was protected by the Vatican the rest of his life, given a place to live and money. And boy, don't you see, there's similarities. They frame a guy like Tony Alamo nowadays, and because he wants to get to the truth, while Surratt, who kills Lincoln, is given everything, right? And Tony sits in jail now for 175 years. And people tell me the Jesuits have changed. And why don't you ever hear of any of these stories, right? But it's so interesting. Now, back 30 years, remember I mentioned Brigadier General Thomas Harris? Well, here's exactly what he said in a book he wrote. He published a small book revealing that Lincoln's assassination had actually been a Jesuit plot to extirpate a Protestant ruler. Harris stated this. He said, "It is a fact well established that the headquarters of the conspiracy was the house of the Roman Catholic family, of which Mrs. Mary E. Surratt was the head, and that all of its inmates, including a number of boarders, were devoted members of the Roman Catholic Church. This house was the meeting place, the council chamber of Booth and his co-conspirators, including Mrs. Mary Surratt and her son John Surratt," I said Charles Surratt, John Surratt, who next to Booth were the most active members of the conspiracy. And they seem to, well, Booth was killed, right? Then we have 4 of the others hung, and we're all told it's a lone gunman. Now that's similar to what they tell you about Oswald. There's always lone gunmen, but really it's a conspiracy, and you can bet in all of these conspiracies, the Jesuits were behind it. Now, Commissioner Harris went on to state that Mary Surratt's son had been a Confederate spy for 3 years, passing back and forth between Washington and Richmond, and from Richmond to Canada and back as a bearer of dispatches. John's mentor during this period was a Jesuit Father B.F. Wiggett, president of the Gonzaga College. And there's still Gonzaga College today, right? Gonzaga University. They're well known now for their Final Four appearances, and March Madness is beginning. But here we have the same university. We have a Father B.F. Wiggett, who was the mentor of one of the killers of Lincoln, and we allow this organization to still sit here in America and thrive? Now, the president, I'm taking this from let me just read this from Tupper Saucy's book, who went in detail on this as well. And I might add, I did many interviews with a guy by the name of C.T. Wilcox, who wrote a real good book on the assassination of Lincoln, and had a lot of factual stuff in there. Tried to make a movie about the truth, and no one is going to touch this story. But this would be the best movie of all about Lincoln. But you see all this other garbage that they put out there that covers, basically there to cover this story. And you don't tell me that's not fake news too? So we have Harris's or Surratt's mentor is a Jesuit priest. Now, he goes on to say that John introduced Father Wiggett to his mother, and the priest became Mary Surratt's confessor and spiritual director. As well, Father Wiggett gave spiritual direction to the famous John Wilkes Booth, who, though a drunkard and a libertine, and utterly indifferent to matters of religion, was spiritually attracted to him. Now, interesting. So you're seeing this Jesuit connection. Now, on examination of Booth's person after his death, it was found that he was wearing a Catholic medal under his vest and over his heart. And you got to look into some of the testimony at that trial, and you'll find it very, very interesting how They cover up this story completely. Now, Chiniquy, who was the priest that stayed close to Lincoln and warned him that the Jesuits would never forget, and one day would try to kill him, he obtained important testimony because he wanted to get the American government or someone back then to print the true story. But the Jesuits, of course, even back then, had the newspapers pretty well locked up. And you're going to see that a couple of them did print some of the truth. But he obtained important testimony supporting the widely held suspicion of Jesuit responsibility for the assassination. He received information from a Reverend Francis Conwell, chaplain of the 1st Minnesota Regiment, a sworn affidavit. Now listen to this, saying that on April 14th, 1865, he was visiting St. Joseph, Minnesota, location of a Roman Catholic seminary. Reverend Conwell swore that at about 6 o'clock that evening, the man in charge of the seminary, a storekeeper by the name of J.H. Linneman, told him and another visitor, Mr. H.P. Bennett, that President Lincoln had been killed. The next day, Reverend Conwell journeyed 10 miles to the town of St. Cloud. As soon as he arrived, he asked the hotel keeper, Mr. Hayworth, if he had heard any news of a presidential assassination. Mr. Hayworth said he heard nothing, as St. Cloud had neither railroad nor telegraph. On the following morning, April 16th, on his way to preach a sermon in church, Reverend Conwell was handed a copy of a telegram brought up by stagecoach from Anoka, Minnesota. The telegram announced that President Lincoln had been assassinated on Friday evening at about 9 o'clock. Now, on the morning of the 17th, Reverend Conwell hurried to St. Paul and reported to the newspaper that in St. Joseph he had been informed of President Lincoln's assassination 3 hours before the event even took place. The paper then published his report. And here is the report that Commissioner Harris got a hold of and put in his book. He said, positive evidence that these Jesuit fathers, priests of Rome, engaged in preparing young men for the priesthood away out in the village of St. Joseph in far-off Minnesota, were in correspondence with their brethren in Washington City and had been informed that the plan to assassinate the president had been matured. The agents for its accomplishment had been found, the time for its execution had been set, and so sure were they of its accomplishment that they would announce it as already done, 3 or 4 hours before it had consummated. The anticipation of its accomplishment so elated them that they refrained from passing it around as a piece of glorious news. So here we go. I mean, how deep of a investigation did they really do back then? Just like they try to, how deep of an investigation do they go into the Clintons now? And how what great lengths they go to frame people like a Tony Alamo who want to get to the truth behind all this stuff. So nothing, can't you see the similarities here? Nothing has really changed. Before we get through this half hour here, the first half hour, let's really find out what happened to Mary Surratt. Now, at the conspiracy trial, remember we talked about Father Wiggett? He testified to Mary Elizabeth Surratt's good Christian character, even assuming her complicity in the assassination. And in Saucy's book, he goes on to say, Wiggett, as a Jesuit, could truthfully say Surratt was a good Christian simply by reserving mentally A, that by a Christian he meant Roman Catholic, and B, that under the terms of the Directorium Inquisitorium, every individual may kill a heretic, and C, that President Lincoln was twice a heretic, for his Protestantism and for his having successfully defended an excommunicated priest. So here we go, the connection between that Chiniquy said, for what Lincoln did by exonerating an innocent priest. Jesuits framed Chiniquy. And isn't it interesting? They framed Tony Alamo here today. So things don't change. These people are the same. They consider Tony Alamo a heretic. They consider Lincoln a heretic. They consider anyone who doesn't follow the Pope a heretic. That may be you out there in the listening audience. But according to in Saucy's book, he said, but Mary, after all, kept the nest that hatched the egg, as President Johnson put it, and was hanged. Conditional to her death sentence was a provision that a petition for mercy, would be attached and sent to Johnson by execution day, July 7th, 1865. Surratt's daughter Anna had heard nothing from the president's distraught. She appeared at the White House to beg him for clemency. 2 government men stood in her way. Preston King and Senator James Henry Lane denied her access to the president, who later declared he had never received any petition for mercy. Now, these 2 guys wanted her dead. The Jesuits, of course, wanted her alive. And the following November, Preston King drowned, his body laden with weights. Oh, he put weights on and just drowned, right? The Jesuits killed him for what he did. And what about the other guy? Now, he was laden in weights. In March, Senator Lane shot himself, supposedly. In the judgment of one modern investigator, some person or persons were apparently determined that Mary Surratt should not live. Shortly thereafter, the Supreme Court rendered a landmark decision that would have won all the conspirators a jury trial. Ex parte Milligan held that the military courts have no jurisdiction over civilians. Milligan lent Mary Surratt's death at the hands of Protestants an aura of tragedy and Catholic martyrdom. Interesting background that we never, that's why I want all my money back from the college courses I went to, because the assassination of Lincoln that was given to me was very well, it was glossed over. It was just this guy who went crazy and shot Lincoln in the head, and there was nothing else behind it. And that's the way they make it look like Oswald, right? All these lone gunmen they come up with. And if you look at all of the people that have died at the hands of the Clintons, and you know their mentors are Jesuits, and you look at all the different things that are going on with these doctors that are getting killed, that are trying to, tell us the truth about what the AMA and the FDA are all about. They're still assassinating people in the same way that they did back then. And the point is, they don't change. And what I want to say at the end of this show, at this segment, is go to freeTonyAlamo.com, and it's a website I started to see if we can get this Christian pastor out of prison. He's been wrongfully convicted, sentenced to 175 years for crimes he didn't commit. And the basic reason is he was trying to out the Jesuits in the Vatican. And he's been doing it for his ministry, and has been doing it for 40 years, and they couldn't have it any longer. And so that's why he sits in prison. So we want to get this petition. You go there, you can sign a petition. You hit a button at the top of the website, and it takes you to another website. And you can sign this petition, and as hundreds of other people have done. And we can send it then to Trump, who's supposedly a Christian sympathizer, and see if he will do the right thing and release Tony. He's 82 years old. He's going blind. He's legally blind and in poor health. So let's see if we can do that. But I hope, what I do want to do, I'm going to start out the second half hour, because I want to show you the connection between Reagan and the Vatican and Jesuits. And then we'll move on to why does God allow evil to occur and to continue? It's an interesting subject, and one that you have to look deep and hard to understand. And boy, it's a great subject. I want to talk a little bit about it. I've done shows in the past, but I want to talk about that today. So come back. We'll be back for the second half hour on the Investigative Journal.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. you will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit DiscountGoldandSilverTrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit DiscountGoldandSilverTrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This ain't happening.
Okay, back for the second half hour of the Investigative Journal. And before I get to that question, why does God allow evil to exist? Let me finish up with the assassination of Lincoln and some of its ramifications. You have to ask yourself, why did President Reagan reinstitute diplomatic relations with the Vatican after they were cut off by our government because of the Lincoln assassination? And the real answer lies in this, that they all worked together. The Vatican was instrumental in forming this country. It was instrumental. All you got to do is go start looking at what was going on at the Capitol building at the time right after the Lincoln assassination. There had been a Vatican artist doing a huge portrait on the ceiling of the Capitol dome, and this had, if you go there and look at it, you'll understand how the Rome has its tentacles right here in America. And look at what's on the top of the Capitol building. And then look at all the other signs and symbols that tell you that. The obelisk sitting there as supposed the representation of freedom. We know what that's all about. And we've talked about it many times on our show. Just for those of you who haven't studied it, just check out the obelisks in Rome, the obelisk in London, and the one in St. Peter's Square. And you'll get an idea. But you have to really understand that Reagan, all of them, connected to the Vatican. And all you have to do is start researching it. Okay, so this question. Now, this is a huge question, and I always wondered about it, and I never came up with really great answers. Why does God allow evil when he's all powerful, and he could just basically get rid of every evil person in the world, right? I mean, he doesn't have to have what's going on today happen, nuclear wars, all this kind of stuff. Well, why does it occur? And I've asked that question to many people, and I still ask it. There's probably, I've gotten a number of different answers over the years. Some, like my first simple answer was, well, God wanted it that way. And then there's other more and then I figured, well, the answer has to be in the Bible. And so what I'd like you to do, since it is a very difficult question, if you have researched it yourself, whether it be biblical or not, tell me what you think. I've had atheist views on it, from atheist views to Bible-believing Christian views. And so I'd like to hear more. You can just do it on they'll make a YouTube of this show, and you can put a comment there. Or you can Google, or you can email me at Greg Beacon, that's BEACON.com, Greg Beacon, all one word, at gmail.com. Now, over the years, I discussed it with a number of people, and one person I discussed it with was the author Tupper Saucy. Now, he wrote a chapter on this very subject that I've talked about a couple times over the years. It probably deserves a lot more attention, but I thought I'd do it again today in this short half hour, see how far we can get through. But what was more interesting than what he wrote is at least to me, what Tupper Saucy was telling me over the telephone, and how he was telling me that, when he researched the book of Cain, the story of Cain and Abel, and came to his conclusions, which I'm going to read to you, he went through a lot of different, soul searching. And he said what he recommends is that people look at that story from all angles. He said, look, Greg, I have an interpretation of it, but there are others. There are other interpretations, and put them all aside, side by side, and see which one makes the most sense for you. And so I did. And what I found was that throughout I went through as many interpretations of the Cain and Abel story through many different people, rabbis. Went to talk to priests. I've talked to Bible-believing Christians. I've talked to many, many people, and I found only a couple took the interpretation that Tupper Saucy did. And I found it quite interesting. And so I thought I'd present it to you today. And if I can't finish it in this next 20-some minutes, I'll do it tomorrow, because I want to read it to you as he wrote it and see what you think. Okay, so here we go, and it's chapter 24 of his book, The Rulers of Evil, and it's called The Mark of Cain. Now, he starts out with a quote. Quote, "The mark of Cain is stamped upon the foreheads across the centuries. Our brother Abel has lain in blood, which he drew, and shed tears we caused by forgetting thy love." Pope John the 23rd, he said that in a prayer in 1960, and cited in the book Vicars of Christ. Okay, so what that reminds me of is that somebody asked me once, if you say the Vatican worships Lucifer, and all these secret societies follow along, do they believe in God? And I said, well, they have to, because if you believe in Lucifer, you have to believe in God. And that's an interesting question in itself. So I believe, since the Vatican is the Antichrist system, and Pope John the 23rd was the head of that system for a while, he understands the Bible quite well, but chooses to worship Lucifer, so twists the Bible. He doesn't believe in the glory of God. And in fact, is committing the biggest heresy of all by masquerading as Christ on earth. And so we'll leave it at that. So Saucy starts out this chapter called The Mark of Cain, which really gets to the bottom, his thesis of why God allows evil to exist. And he says it all comes from the story of Cain and Abel. And he says this in his opening, which is quite good. He says, "We live in the New World Order, just as people under Augustus Caesar did. Not a future thing to be feared or avoided. The New World Order is a present reality to be identified, understood, and dealt with in a way most pleasing to God. It was God, after all, who established the New World Order. We can read about it in the Bible. In fact, the Bible is the only record we have that publicly and truthfully sets forth the essentials of the order's origins and development through time. The Bible records the great decisive events in the progress of human life up to the close of the 1st century A.D., creation of earth and the fullness thereof, creation of man and woman, their turning away from God, the first conception, the first birth, the first sacrifice, the first murder, the first insignia, the first city, the first and only great flood, the surviving family and its peculiar relationship with time with God. All of this momentous data is given in the Bible with the stark truthfulness that it is invariably supported, often to the surprise of many, by the results of scientific inquiry." And that's the interesting thing. We see this kind of battle today between science and God. And what Tupper is saying, he said this Bible has lasted throughout all of the criticisms of the scientific inquiry. He said the writers of the Bible, Israelite prophets inspired by their God, held no monopoly on reporting these events. Priests of other nations reported them too, but in doing so they cunningly adapted them to fit prevailing administrative needs. The result of their adaptations is what we call mythology. One very persistent myth, based on a crucial event accounted for in the Bible, explained to people under Babylonian rulership the divine origin of their government. This was the myth of Marduk. The myth of Marduk begins with Anu, the head deity of the Babylonian mythology, looking down upon earth in dismay. The land is in chaos, overrun by floodwaters and monstrous serpents. You see, nothing's really changed, folks. Anu senses that bringing order to chaos is a job for Marduk. Now, what statement does that, don't you hear that from your politicians today? We're going to bring order out of chaos. Okay. So, Anu summons Marduk and asks him to organize the earth. Marduk, the firstborn son of the moon goddess Ea. Now, Marduk agrees to this task, but, quote, only on the condition that he be made first among the gods, and that his word shall have the force of a decree of Anu. And that's spelled A-N-N-U. Anu accepts Marduk's terms and vests him with, quote, the powers and insignia of kingship. And Marduk's word was declared to have the authority of Anu. Armed with this divine power, Marduk goes to the earth and separates dry land from sea. He polices the monsters. Any evildoer foolish enough to oppose him receives the wrath of God. The result of Marduk's ordination was depicted in the stele Naram Sin, now in the Louvre. In this very ancient Babylonian monument, Anu is shown imbuing Naram Sin, Enoch to the Hebrews, with power over a mass of other beings. Anu's name, seen in the tip of the stele, is the cuneiform symbol for heaven, or the double cross, or, and you've seen the double cross, folks, Marduk wears the Anu signature like a cop with his badge. It makes him God. In fact, the ordination of power of ancient Babylon nations was never without it. Even today, 50 centuries after that first Anu signature, the double cross, we find it in the flag of Great Britain. And so to be the union of, and it's said to be the union of St. Andrew's Scottish cross and the St. George's English cross, we find it prominently displayed in the decor of government buildings, especially courtrooms. It forms the motif for much of the decorative architecture of the U.S. Supreme Court building. That's interesting, huh? The sign of Anu. And you don't say this government's run is nothing but Babylon? All right. It forms the motif of such decorative architecture of the U.S. Supreme Court building. It's on the interior and the exterior. The pavement surrounding the obelisk of Caligula in St. Peter's Piazza, where the multitude stand to receive papal edicts and blessings, is inlaid with a gigantic Anu signature. And I've seen that personally. Yes, no doubt about it. A very ancient symbol has remained consistently identified with the presence of rulership. The mark of Anu, the double cross. Could it be that a symbol of such power is based on a myth? Or is it based on the fact from which the myth sprang? Now, Saucy says the sensitive Bible reader immediately sees in the myth of Marduk a missionary adaptation of the biblical account of Cain. The two protagonists are remarkably similar. Both Cain and Marduk were firstborn sons of mothers, bearing almost the same name. Marduk, son of Ea, Cain, the son of Eve. Both firstborns were appointed to rule over evil, albeit for different reasons. Marduk because of his heroism, Cain because of his own wickedness. Now, this whole chapter is explained right there. And that's why I want to get to most of it today. I've only got about 10 minutes left. If not, you can go and read the whole thing. It's online. Just go to Rulers of Evil, Tupper Saucy, chapter 24. I think you'll enjoy it. But firstborns, look at Cain. He says that Cain was there because of his wickedness, Marduk because of his heroism, so that they might effectively, among evildoers, both were given protective seals of immunity by the God of heaven. God said to Cain, "Therefore, whoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him." So we got this double cross, the mark of Anu, in this myth, and then we have God placing a mark on Cain that protects him sevenfold from his enemies. Why would God protect the wickedness of Cain? And I'm saying this, and has the wickedness been passed down through other leaders to this very day? Has it been passed down to Obama? Has it been passed down to Trump? To the Queen of England? To every leader in every country? That's why I say, it's worth looking into. Do they all work together? Does Putin work with us? Do the Chinese leaders work with us and play a Hegelian dialectic? I think so. In Marduk's case, now back to the myth, the evildoers were chaotic beings ruining Anu's earth. Ruining God's earth, Anu's earth, the myth's earth here. Cain's evildoers were persons who might slay him because he had become... Yes. Okay, so Cain has become this homeless carpenter, and God protects him. Now, the Bible details exactly why Cain became homeless. His farm refused to yield harvests because he had defiled his soil with the blood of his brother. Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. We're not told why, are we? No, not that I can read. It may have been jealous rage, and it may not. Nothing in Scripture indicates that Cain hated Abel. The most we know of their relationship is that Cain talked with his brother and afterward in a field murdered him. Nor are we given details of the murder except that it was bloody. Now, Saucy thinks the blood is an important clue as the motive of this murder. We know that Cain was crestfallen, angry at God for preferring Abel's sacrifice to his own. Abel, the good shepherd, sacrificed lambs from his flock. And Cain, trying to outdo him, the farmer, apparently thinking sacrifice was about returning the best of his productivity to God, sacrificed the best of his harvest. Now, if we look at what Cain is doing here, isn't it remarkably, and I'm saying this now, similar to Catholicism in that your good works bring you closer to God, when in fact that's not what the Bible says. It's grace, right? It's His faith. So you're seeing these similarities, right? Now, God found Cain's sacrifice offensive and Abel's pleasing. Elsewhere in Scripture, we learn why. It involves a principle that is very difficult for many of us to comprehend. And let me tell you, it is difficult. I always have a difficult time with this. The principle is this: without shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. Abel pleased God because he shed blood, the blood of sacrificial animals. The great teaching of the Bible is that the death sentence of mankind has inherited from the original breaking of God's law by Cain's parents. Quote, "Thou shalt not eat of the fruit," is pardonable only by death, by the extreme act of shedding blood fatally. This teaching is the bedrock of the Old Testament and the whole point of the New. In the Old Testament, the people of God were pardoned the sinfulness inherited from Adam by shedding the blood of animals. Wouldn't want to be an animal back in the Old Testament, as Abel had dutifully done. In the New, the people of God, and this is the New Testament, were pardoned this same sinfulness by doing exactly as Cain had done, shedding the blood of a man. To this day, according to Scriptures, all who believe that Jesus Christ's blood has the power to remit sins are imputed sinless by God. Imputed sinless, their sentence of eternal separation from God is commuted, and they are given eternal life in heaven. Now, says Saucy, Scripture does not tell us that God ever explained the purpose of blood sacrifice to Cain, but we know that God is the greatest of all teachers, right? And we know He wants the best for mankind, right? It's unthinkable, then, that He would want Cain ignorant of the life-saving effect of blood sacrifice. He must have taught Cain as thoroughly as He taught Abel, and Cain must have listened attentively, for we know he was anxious to please God. Otherwise, why would he have been angry and crestfallen at learning of God's dissatisfaction with his sacrifice? But Cain, perhaps, was more creative than obedient. It's entirely consistent with his character for him to have decided, and Saucy surmises, okay, if it's blood sacrifice he wants, I'll give him the sacrifice he deserves, a better sacrifice than lambs. And what could be better than lambs? I'll give him the blood of an innocent man. And what could be better than the blood of an innocent man than the blood of your own brother? Wow. And I have done, when I first read Cain and Abel, I've read it a few times, I never got that out of Cain and Abel. And so when I was talking to Tupper over the phone, what he would say to me sometimes is he said, just read it over, start really looking at it and try to come up with every angle you can, and that's what really God wants us to really and deeply get ourselves involved in what He's saying. And so I did. And it makes sense what he says. Now, Cain's intent was evil only in that he sought to improve on what God had commanded, in the way that Saul improved on God's commandment to annihilate the Amalekites, I can never say that word, Amalekites, by sparing their king and certain valuable livestock. Cain knew the logic of God. He was, after all, the first human being born with the knowledge of good and evil. And we know from what happened to Jesus that God's logic calls for the sacrifice of the only one whose perfect innocence overcame death. In his obsession to please God, wouldn't Cain have regarded spilling Abel's blood as the ultimate godliness? And what Saucy is suggesting is that in Cain's mind, Abel was not so much murdered as sacrificed, nailed to a noose very name, hanged upon a cross. Wouldn't this explain why Scripture shows no evidence that Cain sensed any guilt? Wouldn't it also explain the hundreds of ancient pre-Christian myths of young shepherds such as Tammuz, Bacchus, Attis, Mithras, who were slain in cold blood by various villains only to rise from the dead, their shed blood having supposedly propitiated original sin and resurrected them to eternal life? The myths, obviously based on the fact of Abel's crucifixion, all pointed to a universally anticipated event foretold by the Israelite prophets, Messiah's death and resurrection, which would pardon the sins of mankind and restore eternal life. Thus emerges the possibility that the lamb slain from the foundation of the world mentioned in Revelation 13.8 might have indeed been Abel, God's first obedient servant. For it is a fact that the world by which the New Testament writers meant the ordering of human institutional system which God admitted into existence did actually begin, as we are going to see, in the immediate aftermath of Abel's death. If this is the case, then mankind owes a strange debt to Cain. No Cain, no death of Abel. No death of Abel, no world. No world, no incarnation of God, his only begotten Son. No Son of God, no true death and resurrection. No true death and resurrection, no hope of mankind for eternal intimacy with God. So, let's leave it there. And let's try tomorrow. We'll finish it up in the first half hour, so come back tomorrow. And we'll see if Cain's, what's happened to Cain has been passed down throughout the centuries. And as you'll see, there are many, many facts that state that it has. Back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal. Have a good evening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.